It's on? Perfect. Good afternoon, Fleur, Eric. Let me just quickly start by giving a brief background behind the titles that are shown in here so that there's a little bit more context to the conversation. So Fleur, beyond Korelya Capital right now, which is investing money from Neighbor and then potentially other people later on, you worked in the government in France. And for example, among other things, you were the Minister for SMEs, Innovation and Digital Economy, and kicked off the whole French tech movement and revolution, if you will. And then Eric, beyond founding and being general partner at BGV, you have led several legendary internet companies, including 3C and Palm. So this is just to give you an understanding that this is not everything. So we are to talk about kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems globally, and I think we're bringing kind of a European perspective to it, but all of us have been operating in different environments as well, especially Eric is spending a lot of time in the States as well, so maybe we can draw some comparisons, at least between the States and the European market, potentially also to Korean and the Asian market in general. So let's start with you. Recently, France has actually grabbed a lot of headlines with the French tech movement and with the tech visa and all of these kinds of initiatives. Do you want to share us a little bit of the background, like what has led to this opening up, if you will, of the tech world?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's very interesting to ask this question because I see a lot of similarities actually between Korea and France in terms of population size, in terms of market size, in terms of business culture also in a way, because probably this mindset about the risk of failure, the mindset, the entrepreneurial mindset, etc., the lack of funding sometimes also is, I think it makes the two countries very, very close. So I think there are some good lessons probably to learn from each other. So the reason why I think things changed quite a lot in France over the past 10 years, let's say, is that three things I think changed, and you mentioned ecosystem, so I think people changed, probably funding. I think my mic has a problem.
No, it's fine.
So money changed, and also environment. Regulatory environment changed also in a good way. So people, I think I was mentioning the mindset towards failure. I think this changed a lot. So I was telling somebody at lunch that I was in a business school 20 years ago. Nobody wanted to create its own company. I think now if you ask the question to people who graduate from business schools, probably 30% of them would want to launch their own company. So the relationship to risk taking has totally changed. Also, we have role models now, and I think in Korea it's the same. So we have a generation of very successful entrepreneurs, probably in their 50s something, who now became business angels, and who are an inspiration for the next generation, and who act as mentor, financing, also new companies. And I think these waves of innovation and these waves of entrepreneurs is also something that made the Silicon Valley so successful, because there is this transmission and this ecosystem sort of atmosphere. So that's, the people. I think money has changed a lot also, because when you look at the VC industry in France, it has become much more mature now, and just have a look at the statistics. I don't have the exact figures in mind, but when you look at the number of rounds, the number of mega rounds, not only in France but in Europe, so rounds above 200 million euros. Yeah. You had none in 2012, and now you have like tens of them in Europe. So this has changed a lot. So new money has come to finance venture, and this also was very necessary, especially at the scaling moments of companies. And I think it's a bit the same in Korea, where the venture capital industry is now also developing quite a lot and brings some money to finance the scale-ups in Korea. And then I think the environment. So I was a member of government, so I really did my best to create the best possible environment from a financing perspective, but also tax regulation, capital gain tax, all these sort of things that makes the life of investors and entrepreneurs better. Also try to make regulations in, for innovation, and try to leave the state outside, decisions that could be hurdles for the creation of businesses. So I think these three ingredients made it possible that the very talented entrepreneurs that we have in France, but more generally in Europe, I think became more successful and could really have great ambitions and develop globally.
Actually, to give even more context, do you want to share a couple of examples of like details in terms of policies or the tech visa, for example? What does that mean? Like, what are the things that the government has put in place before kind of stepping aside?
So the tech visa, for example, is a very good example because, you know, somebody was mentioning the war for talent. Right now, you know, everybody's fighting to recruit the best engineers in artificial intelligence or researchers. So there's a worldwide talent sort of war. And so we created visa, so accelerated processes for getting visas for foreigners who want to settle in France or want to be hired by a French startup, for example, which should, in theory, but I think it will be the idea, make it possible for somebody to settle in 10 days. So the process, administration process and obtention of the visa will be just 10 days. So that's really great for a company who needs to hire talent from all over the world. So that's one example. And another example is a taxation of capital gains, for example. If you want to have successful entrepreneurs in your country, you need to incentivize them. And of course, it's not the same risk-taking if you create your own business with love money from your family, etc., or if you're just hired in a big corporation, for example. So the risk needs to be rewarded. And so, for example, the taxation of capital gain was not very incentivizing, and so we changed it to make it more interesting for investors, but also for founders to be interested and incentivized in their venture. Exactly. That's two examples. There are many more, but two examples.
I think that's great. Eric, you're based out of Silicon Valley and Europe and Israel. You've seen a lot of different innovation ecosystems and entrepreneurial ecosystem. Can you kind of point us to some of the differences that you've noticed within these regions? And I think one great point that came out last night when we were talking is differences in the approach when you're building a consumer-facing business versus an enterprise solution, coming from different markets and scaling into other markets. There's a lot of stuff in this question, but can you tear it apart?
I'll begin by just reinforcing what Fleur just did. I also grew up in France. Yeah. And as an entrepreneur, I chose to leave France in the mid-70s because it was essentially a startup hostile environment. The capital formation process was basically non-existent, and chose to immigrate to Silicon Valley to build businesses, to be an entrepreneur. And this proved to be the right choice at the time. Today, I'm not sure I would make the same choice because the environment has been radically transformed, and all the key things that I was uncomfortable with are being addressed or have been addressed. When I started my businesses in Silicon Valley, and this goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, the environment was very, very isolated. I would say even insular, in the sense that there were a dozen venture capital firms on Sand Hill Road, which borders Stanford University. And this is where you had to raise your capital. And the expectation is that these investors would, in fact, want you to locate your company right there, within driving distance. They would want to come and drive and visit you multiple times a week. And they would expect that your entire company was there. So this notion of a global startup was certainly non-existent there. At best, once the startup had achieved product market fit and some scalability, they would think about perhaps expanding in Europe. And in those days, Europe was just the UK. And perhaps it would cross the channel and go into continental Europe. So today, it's radically transformed. Startups are oftentimes cross-border and so global at inception. And the country that innovated the model before all the others was Israel. And they did that out of necessity because it's a small country, smaller than Korea. They have no domestic markets. They have great technologists. They're creative. They are risk takers by culture. But they had to very quickly establish a beachhead very close to the market, whether it was in Europe or in the US. So in the 90s, Israel was not yet known as startup nation. It was known as a country where you grow oranges and avocados and tomatoes and stuff like that, but certainly not technology. So this changed radically, and they proved that you could create a young startup with R&D in Israel and market-facing resources, the front end of the company, near the end market. And it's even more relevant, as you suggested, for enterprise-facing companies. Enterprise-facing companies have to be global from the mindset and from implementation, because enterprise technologies are global by nature. If you run a data center in San Francisco or in Paris or in Seoul or anywhere else in the world, it'll be fundamentally the same kind of architecture. You'll use the same components. You'll have the same processes. You'll be vulnerable to the same cyber attacks. It's basically the same technology. So if you're a company that wants to help build data centers at any level that you want of the stack, you better think globally. It's very different than consumer-facing businesses, which can be very, very different from one country to the other, reflecting the consumer culture, preferences, and so on. But the point about the enterprise market being global by nature forces startups to be global at inception. And being global is not just reflecting this on a PowerPoint slide when you build your business plan. It's about operationalizing that in terms of how the different parts of the company communicate, who's going to be on your board, how will you deploy your resources in different countries. And today, fortunately, thanks to technologies like Eric's Zoom and so on, and collaboration technologies, it's much more readily possible to do this than ever before.
Exactly. Fleur, have you seen a shift in kind of the point in time when French companies think that, okay, we want to go global? Did it so during the time when you've been looking at this space, both from the government perspective and now from a venture capitalist perspective? Has there been a big change? Like, are the companies that are being built in France, do they have a global mindset right away?
More so than before, definitely. But France can be a bit of a trap because, contrary to Israel I invested in some companies that are located in Estonia, for example. You have 1.3 million inhabitants, so it's you have to be global if you want to succeed. But it's a bit like Korea. It can be a trap because it can be a bit comfortable to say, well, I have an addressable market. I have 67 million people in France, 52 million people in Korea. It can be comfortable to say, let's limit my business to the borders of my domestic country because it's easier, because I don't have to face other regulations, I don't have to translate it to another language. So I can totally understand that you can limit your ambitions to that. But today, it's true that if you want to go global, you have to think about conquering other markets. And it's not easy when you're in a mid-sized country, I think. But I saw this difference in the ambition, the level of ambition, not only of French entrepreneurs, because I'm a pan-European investor, so I see that now in a lot of the new generation of entrepreneurs who think global exactly from inception. So they have a plan, and it doesn't mean that they need to rush sometimes. You need to take things step after step. But this global ambition, I think, is the characteristic of this new generation of entrepreneurs who have great ambitions and who want to address other markets, definitely.
Exactly. And let's now kind of move into the place which is kind of the reason for this session to be held in the first place, I think. So I'm just trying to extract as much knowledge out of you for the audience of Korean entrepreneurs, especially now. So say Korea has fantastic technology and really high quality research within 5G and all different kinds of other technologies. As you said, the local market is relatively small, so Korean entrepreneurs should also have a global mindset if you want to build global winners, perhaps from day one as well. So Eric, if you're looking at a company that is being built out of Korea, and that company is looking to expand either to Europe or the US, what do you think are the differences in the approach that they should take when thinking about the US versus Europe?
Well, the way you operationalize the global business plan could be different. Essentially, a startup has to do three things. They have to invent and solve a big problem using technology. They have to connect this solution to the right market, the market that's easiest to penetrate and big enough in size. And after that, they have to scale. So these are three different phases. that more or less correspond to different phases of funding when you build a business. In general, when you want to operationalize this in a very practical way, you have to think about who your investors should be. They have to help you go through this journey. They have to themselves have a cross-border mindset. They have to understand where you come from geographically, where you're going to. And the second is you have to think about the processes to keep your company together, even though physically it is distributed. There are tools involved, but it's not enough to have tools. You have to have processes to put in place to use these tools. And the third is you have to create a culture that will bind everything together, such that when people operate in the same company 5,000 miles away, they'll still pursue the same goals. And to me, that's essential. It's the processes, the culture, and the tools have to all fit together. When Young introduced his history, he mentioned that he was mentored by Andy Grove at Intel. Andy Grove was already running a global company in the 80s, and he had a unique way of establishing objectives and key results underneath that everyone in the company would commit to. You don't have to wait until you're a multi-billion-dollar semiconductor company to use this kind of system. Even a young company that is a Series A, Series B stage has to have a system like this to create alignment, particularly if it's going to be geographically distributed.
That was fantastic, because my next question would have been to give examples of different kinds of tools or processes that you think companies should be thinking about. And specifically, when you mentioned kind of paying attention to who you pick as an investor, as a company, what do you think people should keep in mind, or the entrepreneurs from Korea should keep in mind when looking for investors, either from Europe or from the States? And then Fleur, I would also love to get your answer on this after Eric has finished his.
Well, ideally, a global Korean startup should have a local investor that understands the Korean ecosystem, and should also have an investor either in Europe or in the States that understands the US ecosystem and can help scale the company. And these two investors have to be able to work together. So if you're an entrepreneur expecting to raise capital, you should not just knock on any door blindly. You have to knock on doors behind which you have people who have worked together before and can themselves collaborate as investors and can function well as your board members. So to me, it's even though we talk about technology, it's fundamentally about people collaborating. And the choice of investors and the process by which you communicate with your investors, you ensure that you don't surprise them, that even when you have rough patches, which always happens in young companies, you at least keep them on the same wavelengths, you keep them informed, so they can react and can help you.
Exactly.
So these are sort of practical tactics, and I think they would be the same whether you go from Korea to Europe and you go from Korea to the States.
Yeah. What do you think?
Totally agree. So what I see in France, and I think it will be the same probably in a couple of years here in Korea, is that there's more money now. There's more VC money. And so now it's not really the VC who picks the entrepreneur, but it's the reverse. So it's really a very good entrepreneur in a very good deal has a choice between different types of investors. And so what he will pick is, of course, people who will make a functioning board, because a dysfunctional board is something that can be very disruptive for a young company, I think. So you will pick people who will bring different values around the table. And of course, if it's a Korean company, for example, that wants to expand to the United States, of course, my advice would be to pick a very good VC that can bring some value in this expansion in the United States. If the company wants to expand in Europe, it needs to pick a European investor that will back the company in its expansion to Europe. And then you can prefer to have somebody who will be a sort of passive investor if you don't think that you need anything special. But if you need a government relationship because you're evolving in a regulatory environment, like if you're in the mobility sector, or if you're in a fintech, for example, I'm sure that you will need a lot of advice in terms of how you deal with the regulatory authorities. If you need market access because you have consumer goods and you want relationship with the top 40 biggest companies in consumer goods, then it's another kind of need. But you will pick the investors that can bring you network, advice, lobbying capabilities. So you can make your own menu given the needs that you have at that point of your history. So that my advice would be that you need to pick the investor that will bring the value that your business development requires. And it's true that it works for Europe, it works for the US, or it works for Southeast Asia if the development is in Southeast Asia.
And Fleur, let's continue with actually something that touches a little bit upon what Eric mentioned earlier about culture. So when expanding to a new market, especially to a new continent with very different cultures, what's the role of culture when thinking about global expansion for a company in your target markets and internally? That's kind of two specific things, but they interact.
Yeah, so I agree with what Eric said earlier. So that there are some businesses where it's not very important. So maybe some SaaS business, some infrastructure businesses are not really depending on the culture of consumption or in the countries. But some things are really very local. Like if you're thinking of consumer goods, or if you're thinking of some media contents, for example. I was looking, for example, when you come to France, for example, you're a Korean company in the cosmetic or luxury business, for example. There are some very big differences in the way people, consider luxury goods or consider health or cosmetic goods. And then you need to have a very good understanding of the market practices and the consumption culture in the country. So it will really depend on the product or the service that you want to address. But probably when you're in Korea and you've already developed in the area, you've been used to addressing different cultures, different languages, and the fact that Europe is a very fragmented market. It's not a single market yet, with a single language and a single culture and a single regulation. Maybe the experience of having dealt with different cultures here in Asia can also help the startups addressing very distributed and heterogeneous market as Europe is. But definitely you need to make a very strong case and a very strong market study before starting to addressing B2C businesses, I think.
I think an interesting example that I read in a book by Kai-Fu Lee called AI Superpowers about kind of a difference in consumer behavior, very specifically when it comes to internet search. Kai-Fu used to run Google in China, or was kind of tried to start their operations there. And Google search results, as many of you probably know, when you search for something, you get a list of links with their titles and a brief description, and there's relatively kind of much white space, and it's pretty simple, the layout. What ended up happening is that they, I think now this is between Google and Baidu in the case of China. What ended up happening is that in the Western markets, where people looked, there was a study done on where people looked, where their eyes went on the screen. It was on the left edge of the screen, or line of the screen, and they kind of went from top to bottom. Very kind of straightforward in that sense. Whereas in China, when people were looking at search results, their eyes first went to the right and to the top and kind of scattered around the screen. And what Baidu ended up doing was kind of create a more busy screen of search results, because it's just better work with the consumer behavior. This is a poorly represented insight from the book, which is really well said in that one. Now going back to Europe, and as I think we have a couple of minutes left, I'm gonna wrap up the final topic into a simple question to both of you. What do you think is interesting about Europe, and especially the European startup and tech scene right now?
So what interests me a lot about Europe, France in particular, but we're not limited to just France, is that The next phase of enterprise innovation, and probably consumer too, is going to be heavily driven by AI and require really strong data scientists to operationalize that innovation. Quick fact, a great data scientist in Silicon Valley will probably cost $500,000 to $1 million. A great data scientist in Paris will probably cost €150,000. Big difference. Same formal background, same quality of intellect, 3 times ratio. In many ways, what France is experiencing right now is a sort of a catch-up after a lot of pent-up demand. There's always been a strong educational system with math orientation in France, but not a lot of outlets for that, and now there are outlets. So I think there's going to be a surge of innovation which is AI-focused coming out of France, and locating that AI talent there is going to be strategic, and I think it'll be a good opportunity for investors to capitalize on that.
So I totally agree about talent pool. I think, and we also have government or public, systems that help even foreign investors, hire and do R&D in France. So we have a system that really encourages R&D activities in France, and I think it's very powerful, especially because of the war on talent that we were mentioning earlier. So I think there's a very good education system. There's also a tradition of creative industries, and I think that's also something in common with Korea. So strong cultural industries, creative industries, also a strong legacy of very good industrial companies, and I'm not speaking only about France, but about Europe in general. I think the ecosystem, the tech ecosystem is just vibrant right now. I mean, the number of unicorns is now something like 80. Probably next year we'll have 20 more unicorns. So it's really booming. Capital is really now abundant. So there's a lot of things going on, and the market is also very interesting for a Korean company. But my dream, ultimately would be that we would be able to create bridges, because some companies are very successful here in Korea, and you start to see very interesting unicorns. Some of them are here in the room. And my dreams would be that we would manage to create sort of alliances, because it's still going to be very difficult for France or for Korea on a standalone basis. I'm not speaking about Samsung, who is already a worldwide company, but for younger startups in the internet business or in the tech business, to make it against the power of the big tech giants in America or in China, it will be difficult. And I'm sure that if we manage to create bridges between our alliances, strategic or financial alliances between very successful Korean startups, very successful European startups, maybe we can create, bigger champions that can one day compete with the big tech giants. So that's my my dream, but also of the VC today.
Exactly. I think that's a great one. And to wrap up, I think I would like to bring out also one data point that I think all the European countries share, and also Korea does at this point, since, well, the tech and the startup world have been going on in Silicon Valley since the 60s, 70s, so for decades at this point. The European tech scene is much younger at this point. But what's happening right now is that there's been 1 or 2 generations of successful billion-dollar internet companies that have been built. And now the founders and the early employees of those companies are starting their second round of companies or third round of companies. They're becoming angel investors. They're starting venture capital funds. They are attracting the people that they have gotten to know through building these global businesses to Europe. And in the case of Korea, this would happen kind of through building a billion-dollar business over here and having a global team. Then you have a really nice concentration of talent. That's going to create incredibly interesting things for all of these regions. So I think the kind of shifting into second gear or third gear is what's happening probably in all of these places. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Fleur. Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to stop here at this point. Thanks.